minutes. Can I try that? The shuttle buses to the airport run every 30 minutes on the hour and on the half hour. So just keep that in mind and check out, as I mentioned, is 11 o'clock for your rooms if you haven't made any other arrangements with the hotel staff. So our next speaker is no stranger to us. She has graced our conferences before, and many of you have seen her out here sharing her new book with us out in the lobby earlier. Dr. Emily Horowitz is chairperson and professor of sociology and criminal justice, at St. Francis College in New York. And if I were to try to put a theme on her research and writing, it would probably be how screwed up the criminal justice system is. The criminal legal system. So yeah, in criminal injustice system maybe. Her research focuses on causes and consequences of mass incarceration, and particularly on harms of registries and banishment laws. She's covered topics such as public hysteria, false confessions, wrongful convictions, and the criminalization of mothers. Who would think of such a thing? So she has authored or co-authored numerous books and articles. Most recently, the one she had out here in the lobby a couple days ago that's entitled From Rage to Reason, Why We Need Sex Crime Laws Based on Facts, Not Fear. She founded and directs the Justice Initiative, a nationally recognized post-prison college program that helps returning citizens earn college degrees, and I guess you work sometimes with people still in prison too, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Emily Horowitz with Abolishing Fear-Based Sexual Offense Laws.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. The first time I spoke at NARSOL was 8 years ago. I spoke about my first book that had just come out in 2015, and I was welcomed with such open arms. I've tried to come to every conference since. NARSOL is such an amazing, important organization, and I just want to thank so many people here. I'm not going to because I'd have to thank everyone in this room, but in particular Andy, who has done Andy, I want to thank you in particular, yeah. He does the tech, he's always so helpful with every speaker, and he drives to every NARSOL conference and works nonstop for 5 or 6 days, and you are so amazing and wonderful, and thank you for everything you do for NARSOL and everything else. Okay, so some of you know I don't love speaking in public. I have tremendous anxiety and fear of speaking in public, particularly to this group, because I am very comfortable speaking to students and people who don't know anything about registries, but because my work is about registries and you all know far more than I do, it's very, very intimidating. So, yeah, thank you. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to talk about my new book. So I wrote this book 8 years ago called Protecting Our Kids, How Sex Offender Laws Are Failing Us. I no longer use that term, but that was a long time ago when I was first learning about this stuff. And the way things work in sociology in general is you write a book about a social problem or an article or a study, and then you move on to the next problem, because you've the trajectory of most social problems is that things improve. For example, if you talk to people who study LGBT issues, they write about, gay marriage, and then it gets passed and you move on and you write about some other injustice. This issue is very strange, and a lot of what my new book is about is the irony and difficulty of the trajectory about this issue. For example, even yesterday, I remember when I first started coming to NARSOL conferences, there was fear that they wouldn't be allowed to be in the hotels, that there would be protests. Mary Sue last year spoke very movingly about the first conference when there was lots and lots of threats, but that's gone away until this year. So a lot of my book is about how things have grown worse, and that's a problem. But I will end with a message of hope, so don't worry about that. Anyway, so let me move to it's it. All right. So my book, the research question for my book, which is a very personal question for me, is how can people understand this issue? How can people understand this hysteria? I feel like I've spent 2 decades arguing with people, trying to get them to understand the insanity and craziness of this issue. And there's no like proper or better way to explain it. It's just nuts, it's crazy. These laws are insane, what's happening is insane. But when you talk to people, it's really, really hard to get them to understand that. Even in my own life, I have colleagues and friends who've heard me talk, who've read my articles, who are very supportive of me, but they still say, well, you know, I get your position, but I still want to know if there's somebody who has a sex offense conviction living near me. I just want to know. I have kids, and they don't get it. And so part of my project, since I've started this, is how do you talk to people? So there's 3 parts of this. The first part is that the research and data is conclusive. These laws don't do anything. They don't keep anyone safer. They were never started based on research. There's many examples of other countries, particularly the UK. They explored implementing a US-style registry, and they do have some schemes that are similar to registries, but the policymakers there work very carefully with researchers. And if you look at the research for about 1 minute, it's clear registries and banishment schemes, the way we have them, do not reduce sexual violence. They do not reduce recidivism of people with prior sexual offense convictions. So the research and data is clear. There's an entire body of research that has accumulated since their implementation. But before they were implemented, there was no research that suggested they would help. We all know the history. They came out of hysteria and opportunistic politicians, and they came out of fear. And so there's no study that will be the study. People always say, you should do a study to show that, you know, like in my town, residency restrictions were passed and then sex offenses went up. You know, there's no study that will convince people. There's a whole body of research, and in the book I cite the research, but I didn't do a new study. There's no new study. Anyway, I will discuss all the research on recidivism, on residency, on notification. All of this is nonsense. But the second part is that you have to tell stories, right? So people always say, tell my son's story. You know, he was such a good kid. He had no prior convictions, and you know, people will understand if you tell a story. There's no one story that will help. You can tell a story, and one thing I found in my interviews is that people would say, you know, my family understands why I shouldn't be on the registry, but they still support registries. My partner understands that I shouldn't be on a registry, but they're needed for some people. So there's never going to be the story. There's never going to be the study. But stories and research are inexorably linked. But I ultimately argue that it's the movement that has to use research and stories and to continue fighting and use them in a way that is effective. And I will conclude with some proposals for social movement activism here. Okay, so I also want to make a point that one thing that's unique about this issue is that I say this every time I talk. If you study anything in sociology, it's fair game, right? You can study serial killers. You can study, you know, people who like to kill baby animals, right? You can study anything you want, and it's an area of legitimate research. Sean Rolfe can tell you one of the most famous criminologists is somebody who studies serial killers, and he gets all this attention. Nobody has ever asked him, like, why are you interested in serial killers? Like, why do you study them? They're really bad people, right? But every time I talk to anybody, they say, like, why do you study this? Why do you want to study this? Like, you know, is your, like, dad on the registry? You know, they cannot understand that this is a legitimate area of study, and that is completely unique. I haven't found any other issue where people ask you, like, they doubt my qualifications or something as a researcher that I write about this. But Loic Vacan, who's an amazing sociologist who has kind of contemplated these issues, he wrote a great book called Punishing the Poor, and it's a little bit of a complicated quote, but he is somebody who kind of observed that if you want to study sex crimes, you people question you in a way that they don't question you if you study anything else, particularly in the criminal legal system, but just in general. And he makes this case. He wrote this book about 10, 11 years ago, and he observed that the pushback that people face who want to study sexual offenses in an objective way. He says we have to insist that studying sex offenses be treated like any other problem category handled by the penal arm of the state. This entails taking pains to recognize gradations in types of offenses and to describe sexual convicts, not a great word, but he's French, and describe sexual convicts who have served their sentence as ex-sex offenders, as one does with thieves, burglars, and murderers. Again, I know the language is a bit problematic, but he was observing that even he is this sort of very noted theoretical scholar. People would say, well, you can study people who are in the criminal legal system, but not people convicted of sex offenses. And he said, this is a very strange case. All right, so the way I wrote my book, so I interviewed about 200 people over the past 3 years who are directly impacted by registries. Most of them are on registries, but I also interviewed a few wives and mothers. And as you know, there's a number of organizations, including this one, where the most amazing people, the strongest people, the loudest voices are wives and mothers. There's so many women who fight for this issue, and that's really important. And that's something when you talk to people, when they see that, that is sort of a way in. So many of the people I interviewed, of course, were wives and mothers, and many of the people I've met in this movement are wives and mothers. So I organized the themes from these interviews, so I had these 200 interviews, each was 3 or 4 hours, into 6 categories. But the main categories were the impact, the categories were like, what was the greatest impact of the registry? And everybody talked about all the different impacts, but my first chapter looks at employment, second chapter looks at housing, and the third chapter looks at, travel, and then the second part of the book, the remaining chapters, are about the emotional, psychological, and societal impact, the feeling of being alive but not alive, being banished, being rejected by friends and family. One of the things I heard over and over was people said, I'm on the registry, my mom's not, but people won't even talk to my mom because they haven't cut me off, which is something that is very different. I've worked in I work, as Don mentioned, in prisons. I work with a lot of mothers who have kids in prison, and none of them, their kids are in prison for non-sexual offenses, none of them speak of the rejection for just supporting their child, whereas people on registries, their families are put in this position where their families are rejected as well. I also wrote about harassment, and then the last chapter is about the collateral damage to families, friends, and communities. But so in each chapter, I tell the stories, but I also present the research. So in the employment chapter, there's a huge body of literature about the impact of employment on recidivism. It's been known for almost 3 decades that helping people get a job after they leave prison is the best way to prevent recidivism in all categories. That's why in other criminal justice reform movements, you see a lot of emphasis on sealing criminal history records and banning the box, meaning taking the box off job applications, because when there's a box on a job application about criminal history, people who have criminal histories don't apply. Same thing, banning the box is also something on college applications. So there's been a lot of fights to remove these. But one thing that the registry is different is that even in states such as California, where you can't ask about criminal history until a job offer is made, there's no box on the application. If you're on the registry, anybody can see you're on the registry. So even if an employer doesn't ask about criminal history, even if in states, California, for example, also has some laws where you cannot discriminate based on criminal history unless it like directly impacts the job, like if you're a bus driver and you have a DUI or something. But people on the registry are doubly impacted by criminal history records because one, there are some states where criminal history records you're not allowed to look at them unless you have a sexual offense, but also registries are public. So unemployment rates for people on registries, of course, are much higher than for people with other criminal histories. And the public nature of the registry makes anyone able to see people's criminal history. And technological advances have made it much worse. So even people who are off registries, you can still see their criminal history. So the research is clear that employment is the primary link to preventing recidivism, yet people on registries have excessive barriers to employment. So when one engages in organizing and everybody says, well, you know, they're going to reoffend, you can say, well, we need to get jobs. Jobs are the #1 way people don't reoffend, and registries increase unemployment. So I know Adele and Mark and Richard are here and lawyers, but I'm not a lawyer, but I'm like one of those people who's like, you should sue and tell them, like, you know, tell them they should get a job. And then they're like, no. But anyway, employment is really key, and I don't know the extent to which registries and the impact of employment has been the focus of litigation, but okay. All right, residency restrictions. Residency restrictions came out of no research. They were a political move. There's no research. This is just a little blurb from my book, but the research is conclusive that residency restrictions, the only thing they do is increase homelessness. Homelessness also increases recidivism. So in my book, I have a lot of stories of people talking about the struggle for housing, people who have housing but fear that a daycare center will open near them or a new law will be passed. And we've heard many stories over the past few days from lawyers and their clients and family members about the absurdity of these restrictions. So again, in terms of organizing, the impact on housing is so important. You don't want people to be homeless. That is, not only does it increase recidivism, but it increases all kinds of problems, right? You don't want people to be homeless. The really interesting thing is that when residency restrictions were implemented, there was never a study, not even one, that said this would help. It was purely political. And most policies do come out of some research. Somebody just had this idea like, yeah, we're gonna like, you know, put people who are on registries 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet from kids, and that will help. And of course, that goes against all the research about the nature of sexual offenses. But I looked at all the literature since the implementation of the first registries, and there's no research they've ever prevented a sex offense. There's no research that if you look at like GPS data and you see the distance from schools where people on registries live, it doesn't do anything. One thing that was kind of interesting about the interviews that I found is when people talked about their struggle with homelessness, they would talk about using this site, I think it's called HomeFacts, where people, supposedly you look at this site to make sure there's not people on registries in your neighborhood. So you can move to this neighborhood and there won't be registrants there. But a couple people told me they use it to find neighborhoods where there's registrants to try to find housing. So yeah, but they were like, don't tell anyone. So Andy, we can't put this on the internet because I just like betrayed many sources. Anyway, so in the book, even though I tell these stories, I also include the research, but I try to include it briefly because the research is so conclusive. It's like, well, I'm not gonna give that example because many examples are political, but there's no other social problem where the research is so blatantly conclusive. This is just hysteria. This is just stupid. There is no study that shows these schemes work. One of the things I've done as a result of like doing this work, sometimes I get asked to debate people about registries, and my student Tatiana is here, and I always tell my students, I teach a course on sex offenses, and I always tell them like, you know, if you want to do your final paper on why registries and related schemes are good, why the registry regime is like useful or helpful or good. You can do that, but you cannot make a substantive case. You cannot argue it with research and data because there is none. You can just say, I'm a mean, nasty, vindictive, vengeful person. I hate people. I don't think they're human. I think I'm better than them. And that's fine. You can say that. Like, that's honest. And right, don't I tell them that? Like, you can say that. But otherwise, argue why they suck and argue why they're stupid. I don't say suck in class, but yes, I say argue why they're, yes. And it's funny, well, okay, so housing as well. I'm going to, also, I'm not going to go into recidivism, but recidivism, the data is so conclusive. It's ridiculous. Here's an amazing quote from a study. It's in the book. But we know that the vast majority of sexual offenses are committed by individuals who are not potential recidivists. And although some who have been convicted of such crimes do reoffend upon release, recidivism numbers are sufficiently low that it makes little public safety sense to focus so much effort and so many resources on what is a relatively small population. This is true even if we leave to one side the fact that there is no evidence that registration, notification, and residence restrictions are effective at reducing recidivism, whether it is low or high, and even some evidence that these laws actually increase recidivism by exacerbating well-validated recidivism risk factors. And it's a great quote, and I always use it, but also they say, it's not a few cherry-picked studies, it's the consensus of an entire field. These few people, a year or two ago, they published this article called, I think it was called The Dark Figure of Sexual Recidivism, and they argued that all the recidivism data is bad because sexual offenses are underreported. So if you look at recidivism data, it doesn't matter because people don't report it anyway. Anyway, they annihilate that study and explain why that's completely absurd and stupid. But they have this really good quote where they say, it's a consensus of the entire field. There is no study that's going to show recidivism is impacted in any way by the registry. And even before the registry, recidivism for sexual offenses was not high. It's all a myth. But anyway, it's conclusive. It's not one or two studies. But one thing that happens when I debate people is they say, like, well, you're just cherry picking studies. But these are not cherry picked studies. It's the entire field that is very, very clear about this. But one of the things I lost my train of thought, but when you debate people about the registry or you write about the registry, it's the easiest thing to debate. You can see I'm not a confident public speaker. I don't like speaking. I'm a really bad debater, but I could debate this with anybody because there's no argument for it. There's no argument for it. You know, when you practice debating, you're like, okay, give me the arguments for it. There's no argument for it. If anyone wants to stand up and make an argument for it, I will. Besides, you know, it just makes me feel good or some kind of biblical argument or something. Okay, so one of the things that the stories are really powerful for, though, is highlighting the extent of the absurdity and farce. And one of the areas that is most farcical and insane about this, which even as somebody who studied this for a long time, I didn't really understand until I did these interviews, was treatment and the impact of treatment on people and what goes on in this treatment. I work with a group of psychologists in a project in New York City unrelated to this, and I mentioned to them, well, you know, polygraphs are used. And they were like, oh, no, nobody uses polygraphs. And I was like, yes, they do. They use them. They're like, well, they're not counted in court. I've never heard of them. And they're part of this big research team at like Columbia and Harvard where it's just not related to this, but they didn't believe me that polygraphs are used throughout the country and as part of mandatory probation and mandatory rules in some states. I talk to people who have to do polygraphs annually for life. Some of you might know that, but if you talk to people outside this world, they have no idea that this is happening. And the realities of treatment are so insane. The cost, the quality of providers, what people in treatment have to do, what they have to confess over and over and over is so crazy. So I wanted to read a little bit of an interview I did with somebody who's on lifetime probation. Sorry. So one of the things I always think about is like, what is convincing to people? So this was a story I shared with people that are not in our world, and they were like, this is not true. So I feel like stories like this are really valuable. I think one thing to really focus on, again, I'm not like advising the lawyers here, but the stuff about treatment is insane. So I interviewed somebody who's been on probation for 25 years, and he's on lifetime sex offense probation because in his state, that's the rule. And he talked a lot about his treatment and how he has to do this treatment and graduate from treatment and do this for the rest of his life. So I'm going to just read a little bit from this part because I found it to be very compelling, and maybe you will also find it to be compelling. When Reed first started treatment, he got punished for being too emotional in groups. He said that he could barely function because he was overwhelmed with grief after his arrest. He soon learned that the term victim posture was frequently used against group members when they expressed personal pain, and against him when he expressed sadness about losing access to his then young children. Reed said it took him time to understand how providers would deny compassion or empathy to those who talked honestly about their feelings. Reed said he soon learned not to say or do anything that would lead to the accusation of victim posturing, as it would delay his graduation from treatment. Those in treatment groups learn quickly to repress their true feelings, says Reed, even though they were repeatedly told it's a safe place. Reed remembers a friend in his group crying uncontrollably after learning he couldn't live with his wife and newborn due to his offense. It was horrible, Reed said, when the counselor accused the man of victim posturing, and still remembers the man wiping away tears and apologizing profusely for crying. Reed believes the mandated treatment is a failure. He tells me, I have rarely experienced a true listening process in all the 20 years of probation counseling. The system just isn't designed that way. It's like a conveyor belt that keeps on rolling and adding more and more probationers. There isn't time for my individual work. Reed says that one of the worst consequences of his mandated sex offense treatment relates to sex. He says they are forbidden to have any porn or sexually stimulating material. They also must report all sexual thoughts, including dreams, to their providers during group sessions. He says he once watched a treatment provider berate someone for an inappropriate dream. Anyway, so he went on and talked about this a long time, and many people shared similar stories about treatment. I remember one person I interviewed, he said, look, my offense, it involved a sexually aggressive teenager. And then he said, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have said that, I'm not allowed to say that. And I was like, well, I don't care if you say that, I'm just transcribing our conversation. And he goes, you're not allowed to say that because that's victim blaming. And it really struck me that this treatment is so insane and unheard of in any kind of rational understanding of what therapy is. The confessions, the lies, they would all say, well, I would tell them this. They wanted to hear that I'd done something wrong. So I told them that I did this. I was viewed as not participating or sharing. Even people who were wrongfully convicted had to play the game and do this all the time, which is more like a, communist re-education camp than treatment. It's so bizarre and insane to me. And it's also something that is very hidden and unknown. And again, even though I like to think I'm this great expert, I had no idea until I started really hearing these stories. And they're totally embarrassing too. People telling me that they have to talk about their masturbation fantasies. It's not humane. It's horrible. Okay, so part of it is these farcical impacts. Another impact that is also not really understood is the loneliness and banishment. It's not just that you can't go on a dating site. Most people on registries are men who often go away and they lose all social networks, so coming out and not being able to pursue a relationship is particularly painful. Not only can you not pursue a relationship, you can't even build relationships. You're not working, you have housing issues, and then you can't go on dating sites, you can't be on social media. It's very, very isolating. So that's why Lori Jo Reynolds, who's an amazing person, she always calls them banishment schemes. Okay, so here's a great quote from Brian Stevenson. I think one thing that's really important for this movement is to, again, people like Brian Stevenson who work in the larger criminal legal reform space, working with those people that's most important for us. And so this is a quote in his book, Just Mercy, which is really beautiful. You can see it, I won't read it, but it's a very moving quote talking about how we're all broken, we're all the same. And he uses this quote to get people to understand why life without parole is inhumane, right? He's not talking about sexual offenses, but obviously it applies here. Because he works a lot, I don't know if David Garlock is here, but he works a lot with people who are young who get sentenced to life without parole. And he talks about the struggle of that work. And if you read the book, you're very moved and you understand why it's very, it's horrible to put people in prison for life. But he connects with people by telling the story of how we're all the same, which honestly, between you and me is kind of dumb because we're all the same, we're all human. But the fact that you have to explain this to people, again, highlights the difficulty of our issue. Another idea or another way of looking at this is that people on registries are the other. There's been a lot of work on how the Nazis were able to very quickly create Jews as the other, and then very quickly, say, well, not only are they the other, they're not human, we can kill them. And there's a lot of philosophical work in this area. I tried a bit to integrate it into this work. I'm not a philosopher, but I think that's also a really important tool for working with other groups working on this issue, because people on registries within the criminal legal landscape are definitely the they group. They're not the nonviolent drug offenders, they're not the people who are considered like the good people that are impacted. They're not juveniles sentenced to life without parole, they're the they group. And constructing people on registries as the they group is the first way to justify doing anything to them. Many people I interviewed sort of would express these fantasies like, well, I'll probably be in a camp soon enough. If the Republicans win, that's what they want to do. They're going to put a GPS on me for life. They're going to put us in a special community. Anyway, that's, okay. So the final part of what I found, not in my interviews, but outside my interviews, debating people, talking to journalists a lot. Journalists often, like this prominent journalist called me recently and said she wanted to write about this, she wanted to talk to me, and so I sent her my book, and she was very moved by the stories. In fact, there's somebody in this room, she read his story, she said she wanted to interview him, but then she went to her team, like her team of people at the I don't want to give it away, the place where she worked, they were like, no, it's not enough about victims. Can you tell me something about victims? There's no victims in your book. And I was like, okay, well, everybody writes about victims. There's a million books about victims. There's one book, or not one, but there's a small amount. But anyway, she was very moved and she was very disappointed. And she was like, well, I said everything you said and I gave them your book, but they were really nice. But if you write anything on victims, like, let me know. So that was kind of disappointing because I told everybody I'm going to be on the, anyway. So, but I think that one of the things that leads to, and one of the things that Tatiana can tell you, my students would often say is like, well, I mean, like if somebody murdered somebody, that's okay. But this is too far. This is worse than murder. And I'm sure all of you have had that conversation, and it's really, really weird to tell people, you know what, I would rather somebody I love be sexually harmed than murdered. And they're like, what? And what they'll say is, well, you can murder somebody, but like that's in a fit of rage or something. But if you do this, there's something wrong with you. There's something inherently predatory or evil. You're different. Somebody who murders somebody I can relate to. Maybe you got cheated on. Maybe something terrible happened. Maybe they hurt your kid. But people are more forgiving than murder than this, which again highlights the insanity of this. The idea that it's worse than murder is crazy. Of course you would rather somebody be alive than dead. I mean, this is like the stupidest argument. It's like between two 6-year-olds. Would you rather die or be raped? But it's something that people actually argue. So this is not my quote, this is an amazing quote from James Baldwin, but that just sort of emphasizes that anybody who thinks somebody is different from them, who doesn't understand this, are people who aren't being critical, being inward, thinking about this, right? And so people who have no experience have no compassion. So one of the things I say when people ask me, like, why do you do this? And I'm like, well, I've done things that I'm not proud of. I'm broken. I've done horrible things. But you guys don't know about it because I'm not on a registry. I don't have to tell you about it. I don't have to tell anybody about it. I can keep it to myself. And maybe it's something that, isn't in the, world as something that is the worst thing in the world, but it's the same thing. And that's what Baldwin was trying to say far better than me. But we've all done those things. And I think that's really important because people say, well, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. Okay, so the worse than murder argument is, all right, hold on. Andy, how many minutes? Okay, sorry. Well, I'm just gonna, okay. So the thing I wanted to end by saying is that people who are impacted have the most power. Researchers are important, lawyers are important, stories are important, journalists are important, but the rest of us, we can go home. We can go write this book, we can go do something else, we can go on vacation. But if you're impacted, you can never go home. You can never drop this. Your families, your kids, your partners, you can't stop this. So people who are impacted have the most power. And I want to credit Amber Vlangas of Restorative Action Alliance. I heard her say a version of this at one time. And I think that's what's most important. You guys the lawyers aren't going to save you. The sociologists aren't going to save you. You're going to save yourself by pushing forward and coming together and organize, because everyone else can go home. And then I just want to add, I think the primary barrier to doing this work is fear and distraction. It's exhausting, even with me sometimes, all of us, right? We're done. I talk to many organizers who are like, I can't take it. This one is such an asshole. I can't do it anymore. They're so stupid. They want this. We disagree. Distraction is a big problem, but fear is the biggest problem. I was really happy because my friend Debbie Nathan, who's an amazing journalist, who was one of the first journalists in the country to highlight this hysteria. She wrote the first articles critical of the daycare panic. She was a young mother in Texas. And she heard on the radio about these kids in California who were being raped in their daycare centers. And she was like, this sounds off. And she took tremendous risks and wrote the first stories to highlight this hysteria. And I, and people much smarter than me, argue that that was the start of the sex panic that has not, it's supposed to ebb and flow. This panic has been ongoing since then. That was the start. But Debbie is a very intimidating, Paul, often critical and harsh, extremely honest person. So I asked her if she'd review my book. I hadn't even shown her my other book, but I felt like she would understand this. And she wrote this beautiful blurb. She wrote, "This may be the bravest book you have ever read. Horowitz's meticulous interviews with people on sex offender registries returns a modicum of humanity, not just to them, but more importantly, to the rest of us. As she aptly describes, registries are utterly useless for preventing new sex crimes. All they do is sentence to social and civil death people who have already served their time of punishment and labored to repent. We can ill afford to deny rights and humanity to anyone in our culture. To do so cuts us all at an Achilles heel that very few are willing to acknowledge. Horowitz won't let us look away." So I was obviously very moved, and she probably, she wrote that, not me, but but I was so happy, and I called her, and I was like, "Debbie, thank you so much. That means so much to me, and you're such an important person in my life, and this was so kind and brave." And she goes "No, it's brave." And I'm like, "Yeah, no, thank you. I know I'm so brave." She's like, No, you better watch out. This is brave." And basically, it's really good that she said that, and I'm really proud, and I put it on the book, and I'm reading it, and I'm showing off because it's so great. She's a wonderful person. But at the same time, I heard what she was saying. We all know what she was saying, right? I'm a professor, I have students, I am in a vulnerable position, I am not, this book can also hurt me, right? People say to me terrible things. Look, you're humanizing somebody, and look what he did. He took a life. He harmed somebody so brutally, and you're justifying that. What about the victims, right? So the bravery, it's great to be like, I'm so brave, and here I feel very like comfortable and happy, and I feel very loved, and like Anita said the nicest thing to me, and but in the real world, it is really scary, and it does have profound effects, right? So it's, as Paul Dubling said last night, everyone here is courageous, everyone here is brave, but we're also really scared. It's scary. You get one, yes, so I won't speculate, but in my role, there's definitely things that can happen that are very complicated and difficult. As I said, my personal experience is that people are very kind and support me privately, but publicly they don't. Publicly they don't, like I'll notice, I'll like tweet, oh, my book is coming out, or I'm on the, and my friends don't like it or retweet it, which isn't a big deal, but if I'm like, oh, I have a guest speaker, we're gonna have a documentary film screening, they do. And they're nice to, but they don't wanna be associated directly, right? Which isn't good, because we all need our social networks to build it to their social networks. So I think there's two areas of hope that I'm going to just end with. The first is that we've really got to merge with other criminal legal reform groups. That is the most important step in any social movement. I think an idea that the Restorative Action Alliance in New York, where I live and that I work with, we're drafting a statement against carve-outs. And it's a statement that says, if you work in New York and you advocate for criminal legal reforms, if you advocate for sealing criminal history records, if you advocate for no housing discrimination for people with criminal history records, you advocate for all of us. We'll be there for you. Yeah, so, yeah. Yeah, because in New York, we have these amazing groups. We had a group called I can't even remember, the First Step Clear History Act or something, and they said it's so great, it's gonna pass for everybody but people on registries. And that was in their like flyers to the legislators. Look, it's just people with criminal histories, it's so great, we love criminal legal reform, it's a bipartisan issue, but don't worry, people on registries will still be subject to housing and employment discrimination. So we're trying to draft a statement and get the other groups in New York to do that, and it'd be really cool if we could do that nationally, because when we're alone and we're not by their side. All the criminal legal reform groups, they're not divided by offense. It's not like, oh, here's the moms of people who killed people, here's the moms of people who robbed people, here's the moms of people who, were convicted for drug offenses, right? Here's the moms of juveniles. It's all together, and we have to be part of that. And I think us going to them and telling them don't carve us out is the only way. They're not going to do it voluntarily. They give us up every time they meet with a legislator. Don't worry, it's not the people on the registry, right? In Arizona, they passed this amazing law where they don't ask about criminal history on college applications, and they put it into the law that they do ask if you have a sexual offense. Okay, so I think there's two areas of possibilities that are also really important, and arts and culture are really important, as well as social movement organizing and organizing against carve-outs. So number one, I think this debate about incrementalism versus abolishment, it's not a real debate. Every social movement has it. So for example, the people who are advocating against life without parole for juveniles, people accused them, they said, well, if you get that passed, nobody's gonna care about life without parole for adults. But that didn't happen. They got rid of life without parole for juveniles in some cases, and now they're working on life without parole for adults. It opened it up. It didn't legitimize. I think Adele said it very beautifully the other day, something like, I don't know how you said it, but you said it like, yes, we want it abolished, but we also want relief, some relief for people living under this apparatus. So by pretending that incrementalism and abolishment are at odds, it's the place where actually this is the biggest issue is in the pro-life movement, where they'll say we want no abortion, no birth control, nothing, and then some will say, oh, we want no abortion after 6 weeks, and they're at odds, and they call that incrementalism. But even there, they discovered you keep pushing it back, and then you get rid of it. Not that I'm advocating for that, I'm just saying that that's a, but here's an amazing law review article that uses the example of capital punishment. The movement against capital punishment has been successful through an incremental approach, but everybody who works on that, of course they oppose capital punishment. They're not like, we want capital punishment for some people. So these things are interrelated and they're a distraction. Okay, so, this is my last point. This is, just to make it clear, this is not a partisan issue, which gives us some strength, right? So both sides hate us. So like the Proud Boys, they represent like the white supremacists and everything. And I meant to block out this woman's name. I don't even know maybe she's not a woman, but so I did this debate on the registry, and this guy from Reason tweets it and says, here's this great debate. And she says, it's not, you can't see it, but she says, this is a pathetic show in which protections for children were wholly left out. This was not a debate, it was a commercial for predators. So you go to her bio, and this was just the first one I looked at for today because I wanted to make the point. Here she is, she's left, she's science, she's pro-choice, and here she is, she's a big climate change activist. So she's sort of, there's a whole, somebody just wrote a really good article about how the left as well is using the language of grooming and predators, very similar to the right. So one of the strengths we have is that, everyone hates us, we're alone, we're not Republican, we're not Democrat, we're not a partisan issue. And I think Paul Dubling even said last night, Republican judges sometimes are the best ones on this, libertarians and others. So I do think that's a strength because we are so divided politically, but we all are alone and everyone is against us. So we can work with different movements, yeah. I just try to, see the cup half full sometimes. So, okay. So this is just like a slide that I use in my Principles of Sociology class, and it shows social movement, the social movement industry. And one of the things you can see here is you see the way social movements work is you have there's the whole social movement sector, there's industries, and then these are three examples. They call it, in social movement language, they call it the animal rights industry, the marriage rights industry, and the food movement industry organizations. And then you have within each industry, you have different paradigms. So you have in the animal rights industry, you have people for the ethical treatment of animals, which is kind of moderate, and then you have the Animal Liberation Front, which is very radical. So in our movement, we have all these groups, some are radical, some are liberal, some are reformist, but I think we all are under the same social movement organization, and then the goal is to get into the bigger industry, which is the bigger criminal legal reform industry. It doesn't matter what groups we're in, all the groups are important, they all have strengths, we should all support each other, they should not be divided by, these minor political distractions. There's so much work to do. So that's a weakness that I sometimes see in this movement, partly because it's so hard. It's well, we're different, they're not doing anything. So we should follow other social movements and all be together and then come together and work in the broader criminal legal reform area. And finally, frame extension is the sociological concept for this, but when you extend your frame, so what I think we need to do is extend the frame of people on registries are uniquely vilified, they're uniquely bad, they're uniquely predatory, they have to have their own organizations. We need to get into the bigger organizations and say, we're part of you, we're also harmed by mass incarceration. This is also an issue of racial justice. This is also an issue of poverty. So the best example is the environmental movement, which got a lot of strength when they went into low-income communities. The environmental movement historically was an elite kind of movement of climate activists, but when they shared with low-income communities that they often bore the brunt of pollution and they were targeted by waste management, they joined the movement and it got much more powerful, it got much more funding, and then it was no longer viewed as a fringe movement. So I think that is extremely important to frame our cause as one that's exactly the same as all other criminal legal causes. Okay, and then finally, one area that I've also seen some growth that's really important is arts and culture. Here is in New York, Lori Jo Reynolds brought the Chicago 400 to New York, where she had an exhibit in a gallery where she had these homeless men from Chicago who were made homeless by residency laws, mostly African American. They came to New York and they had a show, and it was amazing, and it was covered in art news, and it brought this whole new awareness to this problem. And I was at that show, it was like a weekend. Every single person who came in they could barely speak when they heard these men tell their stories and they saw their drawings, you know. One man, many of them were like, I have a house. I can't go to my house because of residency restrictions, so I have to spend 1 day a week registering and the rest of the week sleeping in my car, but during the day when I'm not registering and it's not nighttime, I go shower at my house. But it opened up so much understanding, and, you know, in a way that me standing there saying, like, recidivism rates are low, you know, does not bring understanding. And art is a really important area, and the civil rights movement used art, and the movement opposing capital punishment used art, and I think this is really an important way for us to also build allies. There was a play on Broadway called Downstate by Bruce Norris, which was about a group of men who lived in a halfway house for people on registries, and it was on, well, I guess maybe it was off Broadway, but it was at a beautiful theater. The tickets were like $75. It got a terrific review in the New York Times, and I went to the play, and the people in that play were not our people. They were not people concerned with registries. They weren't even people really concerned with criminal justice reform. They were people who love art and theater, and they were blown away by hearing these men tell their stories of what it's like to live in this house and what it's like to have eggs thrown at them and not work and be banished. And it was amazing. So it played in Chicago, and then COVID happened, then it played in New York. But I think organizations like NARSOL, when plays like this come out, we should support them and send people. And if it comes out again, that's a really important way in to have cultural elites aware of this insanity. And this play really just shows day-to-day life on the registry. It was really amazing. Also, there's a wonderful film by Rebecca Richmond Cohen, who is one of the producers of Untouchable. It's 20 minutes, it's free online, it was on MSNBC. It's called The Recall, and it looks at the Brock Turner case and the hysteria that came about as a result of that case. It's out now. It's a really good organizing tool for your people and other people. And one of the things the filmmakers did, as I said, Rebecca produced Untouchable. She obviously is very aware of these issues, is that they've tried to go outside people impacted by registries to show the rest of the world what this panic is doing. And in this film, what they argue is that the reaction to the Brock Turner case, which you probably remember, which was complete madness, resulted in the recall of a judge in California, right? The first recall in 100 years, because they said his sentence was so light. All he got was 6 months of probation, at 3 years probation, 6 weeks in jail, and then life on the registry, right? And so everybody said, oh my gosh, this is white privilege. He went to Stanford. He should have gotten 20 years in prison. This is crazy. And then they tried to sort of spin it, and they spun it effectively because the judge was recalled as a case of a white athlete getting off easy. And this film really shows how probation and life on the registry is not getting off easy. It also shows how the reaction, and this is the most powerful part of the film, the reaction led to increased sentencing for sex offenses in the state of California directly. They show after the recall, these researchers at NYU did this study, which is featured in the film, this study that showed that sentencing for all sex offenses in California increased after Persky's recall. And who was most affected? Racial and ethnic minorities. So this idea that, oh, white privilege, he shouldn't have gotten this, all it did was hurt the people who are most hurt by the criminal legal system. And it's really powerful because in this work, I know I see you nodding, Norman, people are like, mass incarceration is a form of racial injustice, but they say, well, people on registries, that's different. The registry issue is also an issue of racial injustice, about people who don't have power, who don't have money. And this event shows how the impact of this hysteria disproportionately impacted people of color, which is a really important message, and it's one of the best ways for us to be included in the criminal legal reform tent. It's very important. And it's not a ploy. People of color are overrepresented on registries, even if they're not overrepresented here. Okay, so I'm gonna just end with, I'm gonna leave this up here for a minute. This is a poem that a young woman wrote whose father is on the registry. I wanted to use it in the book, but as some of you can understand, her father, who's a great advocate, he said, you know, she's not there, she's mad, she goes up and down, she loves me, but it's too much. She wants to, this is a couple people told me, like, our kids support us, but they want to have fun. This is heavy, this is dark, we don't want to talk about it. So when I asked if I could have permission to put it in the book, he said, I can't, because I needed her signature. He goes, she's happy with me now, we're communicating, I don't want to put this on her. But anyway, this is a poem that I did find my students really responded to. So I'll leave it up for a minute, you can look at it, and it's about, she wrote it her senior year of high school. Oh. Okay, well, okay, I'll just read it. It's not that long. She says, I'm a joke. I'm the daughter. I'm a joker and they jest that I'm the tragic daughter, a sad victim of the arrest. And I say sorry, though they should apologize, because they see a felon, I see an angel in disguise. Where my father made one mistake, theirs have made a million. Where my father acts like a god, theirs acts like a civilian. And I have been branded. I'm a joke, but it's not funny. I'm the daughter of the money that was spent on bail, not on my college. But my father, fighting not just with his desire to do well, but to do better. Battling with his own version of a scarlet letter. Contending with society who roots for him to fail, he not only fails to fail, but he succeeds. With a smile, even during his trial, he gave to the less fortunate, though he was needy too. He donates himself to everyone because he thinks it's the right thing to do, but it's not. It's not the right thing to do, it's the heroic thing to do. When he's given everything and nothing's left, he gives parts of himself. And now I give parts of myself. Because when I search his name, there are no longer words that defame, but words of praise. Words that raise him up, words that are there because he didn't give up. So the town, the world, his company, this very piece of poetry can show not just me, but everyone what he has done to change. So you've judged him and my family. But yeah. But again, like sometimes for me, I'm a sociologist. I don't love like arts and poetry. But these impact people. I had a student who was I taught this course on sex crimes. I teach it every year and we learn all about the registry. And she was in the class for about 7 weeks. And then we looked at this poem and she came up to me and she said, oh, my dad's on that. I said, your dad's on what? And she said, on the registry. And I said, and you were sitting here, we watched Untouchable, we've been doing all these readings. And she couldn't express it until she saw this. And I have found that it really opens people up, and I think that's a really important way in, especially people who maybe don't, I don't think she even maybe got the studies were related to her or anything. She just was like, oh wait, that's me, my dad's on that. So I'd like to take some questions or talk more or hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you as always, Emily. It's really always a treat when you come in. Going back to people having to report to their providers about their thoughts, their dreams, their activities and all that, where do you ultimately think all of that comes from? Why is the United States such a puritanical nation compared to everybody else that we would compare ourselves to?
Is this a question from you or from like somebody online?
Oh no, it's from me.
Oh, okay. I don't think you've ever asked a question since I've been coming here for 10 years, so, okay, so I have to think of, I mean, there's a lot written about that by amazing, I don't know if Trevor Hoppy's here, but his book, his edited volume is amazing. It talks about the history of sex panic, and I'm forgetting, it's not sex panic in the punitive state.
War on sex.
The war on sex. Is he here, Trevor? Okay, somebody said it. Anyway, the war on sex is all about that, and it argues that this is part of the war on sex, that is part of a unique American puritanical history, and that's why? I'm not that smart, I don't know why, I just read the books, but I mean, I do know that like the first registries, right, they came out of wanting to police gay men who are having sex in parks and putting them on a list. So it's part of just a sex panic, and now we've moved to this area. I mean, I have thoughts, but they're not worth, they're not, yeah, I don't, does anyone want to answer that? Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
I'll give you just a quick glimpse. You have to remember that the people who originally came to this country didn't come here for freedom of religion. They came here to be able to practice their religion the way they wanted to. So that is a very different thing from saying we want everybody to be able to live free and do what they want, to come to a country and say, we're leaving this other country because we don't agree with them, and we want to be able to put in place what we want to be able to put in place. And I don't think we've ever gotten over that as a country.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work on American exceptionalism. You know, in terms of registries, obviously they came out of like, you know, this, which the combination of feminist activism around victims' rights and law and order Republicans in the 70s when they came together, where they saw they both had power because they both wanted more punishment for people convicted of sex offenses for very different reasons, right? The feminists were reacting to the lack of attention paid to victims, and the Republicans wanted more policing and more punishment, and they saw a common goal. And you'll see in the victims' rights movement, that's where both these ideologies are very meshed together. The victims' rights advocates are often, they have politics where they really claim to care about women and children and violence against women and children. And on the right, they say we really care about punishing people. And it's a very powerful coalition, which is what created the registries, that combination, right? I mean, Bill Clinton signed Megan's Law.
I was just going to ask you if you'd share your slides with us, because I'm sitting way back there and those words are tiny.
Yeah, sure, I'll slide them. And I just want to say, here's another poem, which I'll just leave up there, and I did the colors poorly. I thought it would be bigger, but it's a poem by Amber Vlangas, who is an organizer in New York. I mentioned her earlier with the Restorative Action Alliance, and she wrote about the experience of being a wife of someone on the registry and having a child on the registry and her treatment in her community. And again, it's something I could tell you in a story, but her poem is very moving. And that's also, like I said, people who do not respond to social science often, or, you know, it enhances the absorption when you share art and culture. Andy, sorry. Yes, I'll share the slides is the answer, sorry.
Dr. Horowitz, thank you very much. I look forward to reading your book that I bought on the flight home today. You mentioned that you interviewed lots of people for your book, and you talked specifically about a person who went through therapy and had a bad experience. I personally had an outstandingly good experience in my own therapy, 5 years of intense therapy, which is exactly what I needed and wished I'd had before I committed my offense. So my question to you is, did you also have people that you interviewed that had positive experiences with therapy?
Yeah, actually they did. There's a study, I think it's done by the Connecticut Sentencing Commission. I think like over 50% of people said therapy had many good aspects, and many people said therapy was helpful. The problem with therapy is when it's coercive, when it's extensive, when there's extreme amounts of money involved, when you have to do it for years and years and years, when it impacts your ability to get out of prison, when what you say can be shared with your probation or parole officer. So the question was phrased very well in the survey, which was like, yeah, therapy did help in some ways. I understood some things, but these are the problems with it.
Okay, now this one's not from me, this is
Okay.
from the stream. Early in the conference, we had a survivor scholar. Is the room in academia or scholarly writing for a registrant scholar, for example, in autoethnographies? I'm unfamiliar with this word. I hope I pronounced it right.
There are, so in criminology, there's a subfield, I think this term is like going out of fashion, but it's called convict criminology. And it's people who have PhDs or, PhDs in criminology, and they're directly impacted by the system. There are a few people who are practicing sociologists and criminologists who are directly impacted by the registry because of the nature of the registry. Like, they don't always share it, but there are people, and I've talked to people today who have kids who are in PhD programs who are on the registry, and it's a very valuable quality or skill. There's also people on the registry who've been readmitted to the bar, right, who are lawyers. And one of the values of having lawyers or scholars who are directly impacted is that they can't go home. They're not going to switch their topic. They will be the best fighters for you because they not only know more than anybody else, they are going to keep doing it. So yeah, there's absolutely. But in the field of convict criminology, I don't know anybody who's out as somebody who has a PhD and is practicing. Anne?
I have tremendous faith in you, as you know. I follow you. I read everything you write. But I still think that we are the ones reading a lot of your material, and your students are. And I just think my dream is that there would be like a Ken Burns type documentary on Netflix that the people would see. How are we ever going to bridge that gap to get that information?
Well, I think we just have to keep fighting. That took a long time, right? If you look at the civil rights movement, it wasn't like Rosa Parks just sat on the bus, right? That was 7 decades of organizing. And you have to organize, and you have to build the movement, and you can't get distracted. And I do think, it's a big deal that MSNBC is streaming a film that says, wait a second, this wasn't a case of white privilege. This being on the registry is not only punishment, it's excessive punishment. One of the things I did find that is effective when you talk to people, because the Brock Turner case was a huge watershed moment in our culture. And students will always say to me, well, he's like the definition of a rapist. Now he's in sociology books. What's a rapist, right? But one of the things you can say to people, and Eliza Hirsch, who's a terrific lawyer out in California, she wrote an article about this called Ampersands, and she proposed, she said, yeah, if my daughter was harmed by Brock Turner, I would, go to the ends of the earth for him to be prosecuted. But what if my son was Brock Turner? And so I say to my students, what if that was your brother? And that is something that's really important for people to understand. He's not different. Look what he did. Don't just think about what would happen if that was your sister, your daughter, the victim. What if the perpetrator was your brother or your son? Norman?
And so this kind of piggybacks on something you were saying, but what resonated with me when you said merging with other organizations. And so one thing that I do to make sure other organizations are aware, I started following all the different fair housing coalitions. And I started asking them, have you studied the residence restriction for sex offenders? So I started bringing that conversation to them. And locally here in Houston, when they just passed a fair housing project. And so I asked them, does this include people with sex cases? And so that's how I do it, because like she said, if we start bringing the conversation to them, that way they won't be able to otherize us, so. Yeah.
And I just want to say, this is Norman's first NARSOL conference, and I'm very happy that you are here. Yes.
So, Emily, first a statement from the stream. Thank you for everything you do for our struggle. You give legitimate credence to our arguments that many don't want to acknowledge or even hear. So then a question. In your conversations, do you see sympathetic differences registrants who have embraced therapy, restorative justice, 12-step recovery, and other modes of rehabilitation?
Will you just restate it? No, those are good points. I want to hear the question.
In your conversations, do you see a sympathetic difference registrants who have embraced therapy, restorative justice, 12-step recovery, and other modes of rehabilitation?
Well, I will say I'll kind of like pivot that question. Like, there's an amazing book by Erica Miners and Judith Levine called The Feminist and the Sex Offender, about how a feminist approach to sex offenses does not involve state violence, meaning it does not involve registries or over-incarceration. It involves restorative justice and accountability and embracing things like treatment and things like that. One of the things that I'm very careful about, though, is that people always say, what about accountability? Prison isn't accountability. Prison is like a sledgehammer, right? Prison is not accountability. Treatment is not what? 2 minutes left? Oh, I thought I had okay, anyway, yes. Real accountability is not part of this system. And so one of the dangers is that people say, well, instead of the registry, we could have circles of support and accountability. We could have, special minders who talk to people. And again, I just really want to emphasize, it's people who are convicted of sex offenses don't need more accountability. They don't need more punishment or monitoring or minding. It would be great if these crimes were dealt with outside of the criminal legal system. The criminal legal system just burns everything and turns everything to ash. It's not about accountability or restorative justice or anything else. But of course, restorative justice is a great option. And I think most people who care about sexual violence would much prefer that as an alternative to jail, probation, and registries. Thank you so much, Don. Sorry.
I neglected to mention in my intro that 2 years ago, we gave this young lady the Braveheart Award. And you who are meeting her for the first time now know why. She is truly one of our heroes. And you should never, ever be nervous about talking to this group, because if we didn't love you, we wouldn't keep inviting you back over and over again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time and your participation during the conference. It's been a great conference, and I hope everybody is walking away kind of energized and educated and fired up to go continue this battle. So be safe in your travels home. We'll see you next year in Atlanta. Whoops. Yep, lanyards. And surveys. And FAC's petition. Thank you very much. Have a good trip home.